Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another online session. So tonight we have an extremely important topic, which is related to behavior and managing behavior and dealing with behavior, and also supporting positive behavior. So tonight's session we have Sarah Dove from London. Sarah is going to talk about her experience in this regard. She's also going to share practical strategies for supporting positive behavior. Supporting positive behavior is something crucial, especially in classroom settings. So welcome, Sarah. Welcome to Everyone Academy.
Thank you so
And
much.
can you please, yes, you can present yourself to the audience, and then we can start sharing the presentation. Okay.
No problem at all. My name is Sarah Dove. You can find me on Twitter at PhoenixEdSarah, or if you follow the hashtag Behaving Together, you should be able to find me as well. And I know some of you might be interested in a little bit about my background. I've worked in the UK education system for 20 years. That has predominantly been working with children who have been excluded from school. So they might be presenting with what's called persistent disruptive behaviour. They might find things really difficult for lots of reasons and been excluded from school. I also work with children that what I call self-exclude from school. So they might find things really difficult at school for lots of different reasons. They might be very disaffected. They might stop attending. I also work with children who are too poorly to attend school. So they might have conditions such as cancer, for example, and have to have home tuition, or they might have psychiatric needs such as anorexia nervosa, depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, and so on. Um, and as part of my work, I was invited to talk about some of my experiences in supporting children who might find behaviour really difficult for lots of different reasons. And I firstly kind of wanted to explore with you a little bit about, why another book. And I'm going to kind of read a part of my book because it kind of explores a little bit in more detail about why actually I wrote the book in the first place. And for me, school was a really difficult place for lots of different reasons, and home was a very difficult place. And at the age of 15, I'd already planned to go to college, and I'd also sorted out a hairdressing apprenticeship. My mum had followed the same route, and she had left school when she was 14. And in terms of UK context, that's very, very young. My father had also had left school at an early age, becoming a motor mechanic. And my father left the family home when I was 9 years old. But I collected my GCSEs, which is the end certificate for when you kind of your statutory education. And I had a couple of A's, which surprised me greatly, and a large proportion of B's and some C's as well. And I went to go and see my head of sixth form and asked if I could carry on in sixth form to do my education towards university. And for me, I can tell you the teachers that I loved and I felt valued by. Learning for me helped to emancipate me from a very difficult home life. It set me free when I felt like the world was trapping me. In the years I've worked with children, I've come to realise that not all children find this within school. For whatever reason, children might feel trapped and not know a way out of a cycle of deprivation and educational poverty. Those children may need someone to guide them, and that perhaps might be you. They might need help to develop a sense of belonging in their community. In thinking about behaving together, I hope to give teachers and educators a space to reflect on their own practice and the interaction they have with students to think about how to achieve this. And despite my late love of learning, I've worked in the British education system since about 2001 and lived through several educational secretaries, a series of different governments, and the enactment of various policies. But as I trained to become the teacher, I soon realised that what was an incredibly important aspect is to think about the children that I met during these experiences and to think about when things don't go as you hope, and with this desire to help other people. So that's the reason that I wrote this book, and to think about behaviour. But also, it was an expression that it wasn't really always easy. I've been in classes where things have been incredibly difficult for lots of different reasons, and hopefully, um, I provide different case studies in the book about how you might explore it. But one of the things I say about behaviour, there is no panacea. There is no one way that fits all experiences and all situations, because you bring so much of your character and your personality into it. I do argue that when we're looking at behaviour, there's what I call 5 stages of responding. And the first bit is to really notice, is to really look at what you're seeing. And then when you're noticing, to start identifying what the need might be. And that builds into understanding, and then your ability to respond, and then to communicate how to perhaps prevent that issue around behaviour in the future, or to let other people know what's happening, whether or not that's parents, that's other teachers, that's head teachers, or support staff, with this whole idea that bringing this together might prevent some of the difficulties. So I want to tell you a little bit about Tommy. And throughout the book, there are different case studies that I present and talk about. And Tommy is one of the children that I worked with. And Tommy was 5 years old when he was given he was first given a fixed term exclusion. You might know that suspension, where you're told you're not allowed to come into school for a few days. And it's for persistent disruptive behaviour. Tommy would often run out of class. He was reported to not listen to the adults around them, and his mum was often telephoned to say that her son was beyond the control of the school. Tommy had further fixed term exclusions from school for spitting at staff. Tom said he was blowing raspberries because he didn't want to do what the teacher had asked. After several months of repeatedly being excluded, with Tommy running away from his teachers and not engaging with his learning, he became increasingly aggressive towards staff. Tommy was becoming more and more distressed, and his behaviour then escalated to undressing and threatening to urinate on the windowsill. For this, Tommy was permanently excluded. He began to attend the local Pupil Referral Unit on a part-time timetable for 2 hours, 3 days a week. Now, this is perhaps not a typical story, but it might be something that you see within your own school environments, where things escalate beyond and beyond and beyond. And what was interesting about this is that Tommy was assumed to be spitting at staff, and he actually went, "It really wasn't. I was blowing raspberries." And I wonder if, when we noticed something and we identified and when we understood, whether or not Tommy's exclusion thereon could have been better prevented. And I'm sure, as teachers and educational practitioners, you'll be able to write your own case study and think about, what things do you notice and what do you think could be driving that behaviour behind it. Now, one thing that we might say is Tommy is angry. Why else? Perhaps would you urinate, for example, on a windowsill? Or why would you undress? Or why would you run away from staff? Well, because he's angry. But what that doesn't do is give us an in-depth understanding about some of the difficulties that Tommy might be having. Instead, what I'd like us to look at is a more nuanced understanding around behaviour. And here, this little framework gives an idea about how you might identify anger in more detail. So, for one example, if you look on the line here, is the anger controlled? Is it planned? So, for example, if a child decides to bring in a weapon from home, for example, you might see that as planned. Might not even be anger, it might be fear, but it still might be a planned event where they've thought through that process. Or is it, for example, and this is again something you may or may not have experienced, and I hope you haven't, is it unplanned, where actually they have picked up something nearby and thrown it at you? Well, that might be very unplanned. And then the other part is the direction. So is it targeted towards you as a teacher or another child or another member of staff? Is it really specific to you? Or actually, is it indirect and just into kind of a different, like just throwing things randomly, for example, or throwing insults randomly in the class? Well, that gives you another idea. And it moves away from this idea of, well, Tommy is angry, to go, well, Tommy seems to be controlling some of his anger. So, for example, he seems to be directing it in a controlled way to Mrs. Smith. And that starts to give us a bit more detail that we can work with. So throughout the book, what I have is these different types of ways of exploring different things that you might notice and to provide that nuanced approach instead of just saying, Tommy is angry. So with that, you can have different aspects there of, is it direct and planned, for example, or does Tommy sit with direct and unplanned anger? Is it indirect and unplanned, which can be quite explosive and very difficult to manage? Or is it planned and indirect? So with this, the idea is that working through the book, you can see different case studies and different children's lives and stories and how you might better understand their behaviour. And I know that lots of people have asked different questions about behaviour, and I just want to give a moment to kind of reflect on those. So one question I'm asked quite regularly is, what have other schools done during the pandemic? Is there anything different that people are noticing with behaviour? And what I would say again, it's really important to think about those notions of that personalised approach. Now, depending on where you live and what your context is, or what the reality is around kind of different lockdowns, is that children will have distinctly different experiences. So, for example, in the UK, we have had, I think it's 2 national lockdowns. I think it's 2, it might be 3, I've lost count. But for some children, they've really enjoyed being at home. And actually, they've had access to lots of different resources, and they haven't really been worried about COVID-19 in particular. Other children might be living with vulnerable adults, for example, and find it entirely problematic that they're at home and finding things very difficult. Or they might not have had access to digital resources like computers or broadband to be able to access classes. Some children, sadly, will be in situations where actually they're in abusive situations at home, and school, just like myself, was one of my safe places. So in terms of behaviour and the pandemic, that's a kind of frequent question that's come up for me. And one of the things I would say is knowing about your children's lives and their experiences are really important. And just asking that simple question, is there anything I need to know that would help me better support you at school? Very simple, open question. And there's lots of questions in the UK, and I'm certain in Australia, I'm certain in America, I'm not so sure in the context of Morocco, so perhaps people can educate me. But the difference about how do we hold children accountable and responsible for their behaviour versus the idea of punishing them and telling them off and being detrimental. How do we help children understand rules and laws eventually? And it goes back to this idea that's saying actually there is no one size fits all for behaviour. It's very important that a school develops cultures of social norms and responsibilities within the school, but also understanding that children come from hugely different places and situations, and to be mindful of that. And actually, if we are able to self-regulate as adults and demonstrate that regulation to children and have an adult that they can trust and they know that will support them with boundaries, but as well as acknowledging that things are difficult for them, I think that's a really empowering position. Another question as well that I'm routinely asked is around, well, what are positive behaviour strategies and how long does it take? And again, this is an incredibly difficult question. And I think even though I've worked in education forever and a day, it feels, I can still hold classes and teach and things go terribly wrong. And that can be for a whole host of different reasons that actually, lots of the children are having really difficult days and the group dynamics are really difficult. Or maybe I've responded in a way that isn't helpful. And I think sort of at this bit, I've said about responding, sometimes we skip these steps, don't we? And we might notice that someone's not doing the right thing from our perspective in a class way. We may not really identify, not really understand, and go straight to responding because we are human, but that might not be helpful as well. So in terms of what has worked within schools, every school is different, but building that idea around developing a positive culture within your school where people know that they are regarded in high esteem and you have high aspirations, but also that you are a community where everyone is expected to be safe and behave in a way that helps with learning, I think is a positive way to go. And how long has it taken? Well, actually, to develop that culture and that community takes a while, because developing those ongoing rules and within your school and that positive reinforcement doesn't happen overnight. And also, one of the things that sometimes what education does in the UK is they can make a martyr out of someone. So what I mean by that is one child might do something wrong, and then they are punished beyond what they should be punished to set an example. And I wouldn't say that's helpful either. I think rules should be fair and consistent whilst really taking into account some of their individual needs. And I know there's lots of different things, and people might want to ask questions and so on. Obviously, you can have a look for the book. It's on Amazon, and that's what it's called. And this is what it looks like. Oh, can I do it in the screen? You can connect with me via Twitter or via email. You're more than welcome. But I also host a kids mental health chat on a Tuesday on Twitter, and you can keep the conversation with the hashtag behaving together. I've spoken loads now, so I'm going to have a sip of tea and hope there's some questions I can answer.
Great. So you actually mentioned very interesting ideas about managing behavior. So there is the idea there are two approaches here to hold the children responsible for their behavior and to punish them. You said that this is detrimental. The second choice is detrimental. Why do you think it is detrimental?
I think ideas of punishment are tied in with ideas of retribution. And I don't think retribution has any space in terms of education. I think children need to learn, and they need to understand, and they need to be guided, and they need to have modelling, and they need to know actually X is deeply inappropriate or it's against our norms of the school and we do not tolerate this. But some children may need to have that reiterated and taught over and over again in order for them to understand it. And I go back to that example of Tommy, and actually teachers noticed that he spat. But actually he didn't. He was blowing raspberries. And I think punishing that child for spitting, which wasn't the actual real story, wasn't helpful. It didn't teach him any different. They didn't give him the option to say, look, I was actually just doing this. But I also do believe that certain behaviours are not safe and they're not appropriate in the schooling environment. But yet all children have a right to an education. So there's a tension there. And how do we recognise that tension? And we know that some children find things really difficult in mainstream school for lots of different reasons. Now, it might be because their home life is very difficult and they've not been taught appropriate ways to behave. It might be because they're reenacting trauma. It could be that actually the routines of the school are such that they don't really know what is appropriate behaviour or not. Or sometimes it's because rules are overly strict when they need not be, or they aren't consistently applied. So for me, punishment isn't conducive to a development of a child. And I think what it doesn't do is it doesn't teach them. It teaches them that adults get angry and they potentially punish them. And yes, that might be right, because I suppose in society we have rules, and if you do X, Y, Z, you will be told off in no uncertain term. But I think childhood is an opportunity to develop a child, and it's to teach them. And schools are places for education, they're not places for punishment.
So consistency is a key word here, right? When it comes to behavior or dealing with behavior, so we should have like a certain pattern, a certain strategy which is consistent, right?
Absolutely. Consistency is really key, but whilst acknowledging that consistency has to be applied in a way that is fair. Now, for some children, it may not be fair to be consistent for lots of different reasons, because they may have individual differences that makes consistency unhelpful and actually potentially discriminatory. The kind of classic example that people give is let's say, for example, a child has attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and they might find it difficult to not call out in class. And the rule is that you put your hand up, but the child is impulsive. They're developing in lots of different ways. They may develop strategies in which they will eventually learn, put up their hand, but they also might be really excited and just shout out an answer. Now, should that child be punished because of neurodiversity? No. Should they be celebrated the fact that they want to take part in class? Absolutely. Should it be, I love, let's say, David, I love the fact that you're so enthusiastic, but can we just give Melissa a chance to answer that? Things like that. It's not about punishing, but it is about redirection, and it is about reiterate and making sure that child knows that their views are valued, but also so is Melissa's and so is someone else's.
Yes, there is also something very interesting. It is a comment, and maybe actually you will agree with it or not. But anyway, I will mention it. So sometimes the type of reaction we have create more problems. For example, let's give the example of the classroom. For example, if the child or the learner is behaving in a certain negative way, the reaction of the teacher sometimes is extreme. Do you get my point?
Yes.
So
And
the reaction sometimes it's extreme, and it affects it escalates the behavior, right?
I think so. I think there's bits where, but again, let's be clear, it's natural. Teachers are human. So I'm not trying to castigate anyone or say you were wrong or you were
Yes,
bad.
yes.
I've been there as a teacher where a child has shouted and I've got angry because I am human. But clearly that inflames the situation, and it doesn't necessarily help. So, one strategy, which is very helpful, is if a child is dysregulated, so if they're shouting, if they're angry, if they're finding it difficult to regulate, is you acknowledge that. And it's called attunement. So, the idea is that you go, gosh, I can see you're really angry. And you give the child to correct you because actually they might go, oh, they might swear and say, no, I'm this, or no, I'm really upset, or no, I'm furious, or whatever it might be. You acknowledge what's going on. And for me, one of the things that I do is I say, I can see you're really angry. I'm just going to sit down and I'm going to wait. And often the child will come and sit down next to me, and there might be quietness, or there might be ongoing shouting, or they might pace around. And I let that and I sit with that, and it's quite uncomfortable. Or one thing is if I feel worried about a child's safety, and I say, look, I have to watch where you're going, but I'm going to keep my distance. But the idea is I just want to know that you're safe. And that can be really reassuring. And I think if you say things like sit down, stop, or you shout, that may be helpful in lots of different circumstances. And I think if you know the child that you're working with really well, that might be appropriate. But I think possibly there are other approaches that you might want to try. And it feels very risky as a teacher to stop, to sit, to notice, to listen, to respond. But I think that can give you the power back a little bit. I think if you shout or you say, get out of my class or anything like that, I think it can, yes, it may relieve the situation in that short moment, but I don't think it necessarily resolves the situation.
Sarah, also you mentioned also the group dynamics, and you said that it's a little bit difficult. Do you think peers or children, when they are in groups, they affect each other? The
Yeah,
behavior is like contagious.
I think children,
especially
teenage,
negative behavior.
yeah, I mean teenagers especially, I suppose. I mean, I think even children, even little ones. I think yes, I think we are social creatures and we engage in social ways, and that can be positive or negative, and so on. Sometimes what you might want to do if there's a bit of a peer leader who seems to be leading others, giving them responsibilities and jobs can be really helpful. So Aaron, I would really like if you could hand out the books for me. Oh, thank you so much. That kind of thing can be really positive. But we also know that we live in social groups, and I think girls as well can be, especially kind of adolescent teenage girls, like emerging adolescents, can be incredibly difficult with one another, and they might have all kind of anxieties about how they look, their self-esteem, how they're being judged by others. And all of this is happening whilst you might be trying to teach maths or English or geography or whatever you're trying to teach. That all these kind of group dynamics, plus their relationships with their family, plus the fact that they don't, they're tired because they had a late night last night, or they're grumpy because actually lunch was rubbish earlier on, or they haven't done their maths work, so they're really worried about what Mr. Smith might say to them. So there's all these things happening, and you can't isolate any of those moments in time. And I think as a teacher, we're often juggling a whole range of different aspects in our lives, really, and children's lives, and all those interactions in between.
Yes, so maybe we should look at behavior or at children or at learners who are misbehaving. That there is something wrong in their lives. There is a family problem. There is a social problem. There is because misbehaving is an indicator of something wrong.
I mean,
Yes,
I think as well. I think children are children, and they may do things that we don't like for lots of different reasons. Adults do things that we don't like for lots of different reasons. But I think we should be in a position where we try and understand if there's anything else going on for that child. So we often talk about children that are excluded in the UK, or perhaps adult prison populations, that we look at some of their kind of previous experiences. Often they may have had traumatic experiences in the past. And finding it difficult to be able to deal with those and understand about those. They might have difficulty with being regulated in terms of their emotions, so knowing when to calm down, how to calm down successfully, or even just kind of engaging with the kind of rules and routines can be really difficult for lots of different reasons. If you don't have that experience at home, to then have that experience in school can be quite tough, and you might need extra support in regards to that. I don't think every child who behaves in ways that we don't like has had adverse childhood experiences, but I think some have. And I think it's worth going beyond just what we see, like that noticing, to really understanding what's going on for that child as well. And I think often sometimes behaviour can be anxiety led, and we often talk about disruptive behaviour or bad behaviour when actually often it's around anxiety and that kind of fight or flight response or freeze response. For example, I mentioned throwing of tables, chairs or tables sometimes in my work, and that can be about, it's a very visual, keep away from me, don't come near me. Now clearly that is not acceptable, but if you start understanding that they're worried because of X, Y, Z, it gives us more of an understanding. And actually, in the book that I wrote, I speak about a boy who throws chairs. And it was because he wanted to be excluded, because he was really worried about his mummy going away and disappearing. And that was partly because his older brother was taken into a psychiatric unit, and he was really worried about his mum being on his own and his mum being taken away. Being at home for him was safer. So rather than just seeing the action or the behaviour, really trying to kind of go back and understand what's going on for that child is a lot more
yes.
powerful.
That's great. Great tips. Thank you so much. So the 5 stages you mentioned: noticing, identifying, understanding, responding, and communicating.
Yeah,
So noticing. So in this stage, we notice the behavior, right?
yeah.
We collect information about the situation. Then what is the difference between noticing and identifying?
So it
Or
goes.
maybe is there any difference between noticing and identifying?
So I think noticing is about what you see.
Yes,
Identifying is digging a little bit deeper and trying
yes,
to
yes.
kind of. So, for example, with the anger, I gave the example of Tommy is angry. But then I start kind of building in, well, he's angry, but I identify whether or not, well, does it seem controlled and planned, or does it seem unplanned, or is it directed towards someone? So that's the idea behind the kind of difference between the noticing and the identifying. I notice that Tommy is angry, but then I start identifying where that anger sits in more detail, and then building a picture and
Oh, yes.
developing an understanding of that.
So the last stage is communicating. It's like it is a sort of intervention, right?
So with communicating, I'm literally just looking at the book because I have a whole kind of um, chapter on it. The idea of communicating is the idea of the conversations that we have for it. It's around how we safeguard children, but how we safeguard ourselves, but also kind of structural safeguarding. So how do we communicate across a school system to make sure that behaviour is good? How do we communicate to parents and families about plans and make sure they're involved as key stakeholders? But also communicating is about how we communicate our own needs. So I give up a whole chapter about how do we keep
Oh
ourselves
yes.
safe and well. Because actually working with kids is really hard. It's really difficult. So how do we make sure that when there's things that happen that we don't want to happen and are very upsetting, how do we make sure that we keep our own emotional well-being at the heart and center?
Why you called your book Behaving Together? Is
Good
there
question.
some story behind this?
So yes, initially I think I was asked to call it managing behavior, and I said I don't want to manage behavior. Um, Actually, I think it is not about me managing behaviour and controlling behaviour, but it's how we respond together to improve the behaviour across a school community. So it was very intentional around working together on that. But I also completed my master's degree in a psychiatric inpatient service. So working.
Congratulations.
Thank you. It was a while ago now. It feels like I'm doing a PhD as well, so it feels like I think it was 15 years ago I finished my master's, so it was a while. But I called it Behaving Together, and it was the children in the psychiatric unit writing the rules in the education department about what would good behaviour look like. So it's a homage as well to them, and the idea that actually isn't just about giving rules, but it's how we all interact together to make a safe community.
Yes, this is great. So do you think probably maybe of writing a second edition?
I mean, I don't know. So it only came out on a few days ago. Depends how popular it is. I mean, it depends if anyone buys it. If no one buys it, I'm sure not. But I do wonder whether or not there's. I would like to focus more on how we liaise and engage with families and their communities with children, because I think we forget that parents are key people in supporting children's behaviour. So I'd like perhaps to do a kind of more work around that and trying to explain how do we
Yes.
work with wider communities.
So primarily, mainly it is addressed to teachers and yes, and students, and then to parents. No.
So predominantly, I would say teachers, head teachers, senior leaders, and in the UK we have special educational needs coordinators. I would say those are the main groups of people that the book is aimed towards. But there are also a number of parents that have bought the book to be able to understand their own child's behaviour. So I've had quite a few parents whose children have been excluded that have bought the book to be able to understand a little bit more about how to support their child to attend school regularly and safely. Um, but predominantly, I would say people that work in education, like learning support assistants as well, equally, I think it's probably be helpful. But also teachers in training, it seems to be quite popular with as well.
Yes, this is a great discussion. This is really an important topic, as I said in the beginning, because teachers most of the time, most of classroom time is spent on managing and dealing with behavior. So there is, and this is really difficult. So do you have maybe any tips for teachers who have classes who are out of control?
So
Tips?
yeah, one of the things I say is don't just buy my book. There are other books out there. Mine is not the panacea. There's other bits. No, it's not very good
No,
advertising.
you said one. No, there is no one size that doesn't fit all. So
No,
maybe you should the teacher should adapt or adopt his own strategies, right?
I think so, but I think it also needs to be a school culture of positive behaviour. So this
Oh
idea
yes.
of how do you all together kind of acknowledge what good behaviour looks like, and I think recognizing positive behavior is really important. I think some of those quieter voices get lost. So the children that do behave exceptionally well, you don't notice so much because sometimes the noisier children you get more of their attention. But I would say things like responding positively to behavior when you see it, notice when things go right is really important. Um, Preempt issues. If a child is doing well, ring home. Because what you're trying to establish is positive relationships with the home community. Often parents whose children don't behave very well, the first they hear from the school is when you ring them up to say things haven't gone very well. Ring them up before then. Establish a relationship where the parent wants to support you as a teacher. I would also say is make sure that you're fair and proportionate, and that you really try and find out what's going on for the child. And that can be asking the child directly, I don't know what's happening here, but actually you're not behaving in a way that helps with learning. Can you tell me more what's going on? And if they just say, oh, I find your lessons boring or this, that, and the other, then that's a different conversation. But if it's they go, you know what, I'm finding things really hard because I just don't understand maths, and it's a way of developing a conversation rather than just shutting it down. Now, I would also say it's about, if you say you're going to do something, don't say it in the heat of the moment when you're angry,
Do
because
it.
that's never helpful. But also,
Yes.
you do need to follow through. So if you say, actually, if you keep on doing that, Daniela, then I am going to ask you to stay behind after class. And if they keep on doing it, then you do have to ask Daniela to stay behind after class and talk to her about what's going on, because otherwise you've lost. You're in this position where you've said something and you haven't followed through, and that's never a good perspective. But I would also say ask for help. If you're finding things difficult in your class, what is your school community and culture like? Are you getting help from the senior leaders of your school as well? It shouldn't be you on your own tackling this.
This is great. So, Sarah, thank you so much for sharing your ideas with us. This was really interesting and useful. So, do you have maybe future projects about this topic?
So I'm giving a number of talks about this topic in the next few months. I'm doing a lot of work with local authorities, individual schools, multi academy trusts around kind of
Great.
behaviour and supporting. Um, I'm developing links with teacher training, for example. I'd like to extend that internationally, not just nationally. And how do we have these conversations about behaviour that are inclusive, and it mean that the child feels that they belong and don't feel excluded? So there's lots of work that I'm doing generally. COVID has unfortunately meant that more of my work is at home. It'd be quite nice to keep thinking beyond the UK. So I'd like to continue that as kind of people become safe and well, because obviously people's physical health is of paramount importance. But yeah, hopefully we'll continue that around those kind of conversations about behaviour. And I do lots of kind of keynote speaking and things like that, really.
Yes, I think conversations need to be start going on this topic, because it's very interesting and useful for teachers and for people in general.
Mm.
So
I'm
th-
biased, but I think it's really interesting.
yes, thank you. So do you have any final comments for our audience before we close the session?
um, I would go back to those 5 stages of responding, and just also be kind to yourself. And I know that everyone wants to work well and everyone wants the perfect class and they just want to teach, and all those sorts of things. But humans are so much more complex than that. And it takes time. And we all
Yes.
have, frankly, quite bad days in the classroom for lots of different reasons. So being kind to students starts with being kind to yourself.
So thank you so much, and hope to talk to you when you write a second book, maybe.
Thank you.
So thank you so much, Sarah.
Thank you very much.
Bye bye.